Welcome everybody to the Nobody Listens to Kevin podcast, where I tell you the truth about life and relationships that you will not hear anywhere else. Today I want to talk about some uncommon red flags when you begin dating someone. These red flags are not as uncommon as you would think. They are just uncommonly noticed as red flags. So the red flags that people tend to talk about are this person is a liar, this person is a cheater, this person has slept around a lot, this person has a bad reputation, this person has an anger problem, this person is cheap. Those are all things that stand out when you first start dating someone, that are fairly low-hanging fruits. Those things are fairly easy to notice as red flags, and they get talked about pretty often. They're circulated among friends and family of like, yeah, this is a thing that you need to watch out for when you're dating someone. But what about the things that are not talked about so often? I want to mention 5 of them to you today that are actually, as I said, very common, but they're not commonly referred to as red flags. And I'm going to explain why each one of these things is so dangerous and why they should be noticed as red flags right up there with the other ones that get talked about more commonly. So there are 5 types of people that I want you to avoid when you're looking for red flags, okay? The first is what I call the take me or leave me. The take me or leave me person is the one who says, this is the way I am, you either like it or you don't. And this is a huge problem because right off the bat, that indicates somebody who is not willing to change. They're not going to change their behavior for you. They're not going to listen to you. They're not going to humble themselves and apologize to you. Basically, they are saying from date number whatever it is, if you got a problem with me, it is your responsibility to handle it because this is quote unquote who I am. Now, this gets to a slightly deeper topic of the idea of changing someone for a relationship. What you're going to hear out there in the popular lexicon is that you should never change yourself and you should never ask somebody to change, right? And I can tell you right now, guys, that nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the only constant in a relationship is change. The only thing that you can predictably rely on if you want to have a successful relationship is the willingness to change yourself and to ask the other person to change themselves. Now, I'm not saying that you should change your core characteristics. For example, if you're an extroverted person, you don't need to become an introverted person. If you're an emotional and sensitive person, you don't need to become somebody who is stoic and hard. But you do have to be willing to change your behavior over and over and over again. And if your partner is asking you to do something differently, to have a little bit more sensitivity, to communicate in a slightly different way, to approach you in a slightly different way, to think about things and open your mind, whatever it may be, and you say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm X type of person, so you either want me or you don't. That's a major red flag because that is an indication of somebody who is not growth oriented. That is a person who has a fixed mindset and who either doesn't think that anything is wrong with them, or this is even worse, they might think that things are wrong with them, but they're not willing to change them. And that's a problem. So watch out for the take me or leave me person, okay? Second type of person that I want you to watch out for is the take the edge off person. And this is something that people really don't talk about very often. The take the edge off person is someone who needs to have a glass of wine every night or needs to smoke a joint every morning or every evening in order to relax or in order to sleep, in order to take the edge off, as we like to say, right? Listen, I'm not into drinking or smoking, but if somebody wants to drink or smoke truly in a recreational fashion, like once a week, have a couple of drinks or, when you're with your friends on a Sunday, you want to smoke a joint after the work week is over, you fulfilled all of your obligations. Sure, that's perfectly acceptable. People like to do that. But when somebody is using a substance habitually, there are two things that are happening. The first thing that's happening is that is a coping mechanism for them to deal with their stress. And it is so popular, drinking, smoking, microdosing mushrooms, taking edibles, all of these things, they are so common that we don't think of them as being abnormal. We don't think of them as being problematic. As a matter of fact, a lot of people like to say, oh yeah, I don't believe in psychiatric medications. I don't like to go to the doctor and I don't want to be on pills or whatever. But then what they do is they self-medicate with another substance, such as weed or wine or liquor, whatever it may be. And that is their way of coping with their stress. But because it is so commonly accepted, it is not seen as a problem. The second thing that's happening here is that person is increasing their risk factor for addiction by an astronomical percentage. And if I told you you should stay away from a person who has a history of addiction, that's kind of a simplistic statement because there are addicts who have become sober and turned their lives around. But if I told you, yeah, don't go out with somebody who's an addict, you'd probably be like, duh, yeah, that makes sense, right? But if I told you that somebody is exhibiting signs and symptoms of being on the path to developing a serious addiction, most people don't see having a drink every night as increasing your risk factor for addiction so highly, but it is. And you don't want to end up with that person. You don't want to end up with the person who doesn't have control over their stress and their emotions, so they have to rely on an external substance. The third red flag that I want you to look out for is the person who says, well, that's not my fault. Oh, how I love the that's not my fault person, okay? Essentially, this is the person who is incapable of taking responsibility. And here's why this is a red flag that's often overlooked. When you first start dating someone, they will tell you their sob story. They'll tell you about how their ex divorced them and how their kids don't talk to them and how they got screwed over by their business partner and how they got a flat tire on their way to work and oh my God, all of these things, right? And you might be like, wow, this sucks. This person has had a hard life or this person's really going through it or whatever. But what you actually need to be looking for is what is the degree of personal responsibility that person is willing to take? And are they exhibiting that in front of you right now? Because if they are painting a story of their life that everything that has happened to them is not their fault, then I guarantee you that when you start having arguments and you start clashing heads, which you will, because it's normal in a relationship, you're going to end up with somebody who's not willing to take responsibility. If they're not willing to take responsibility, it means that they're not going to apologize. If they're not going to apologize, it means that they're not going to change, right? And then you're going to be stuck banging your head against the wall. We'll talk more about that in a second. But my wife screwed me over and took my money and now my kids don't talk to me is a very, very different story from my wife and I got a divorce. She made some mistakes. I made a lot of mistakes. She did some things that I wouldn't have done, but I understand how my actions contributed to the situation that I'm in. And I just want to make sure that I don't repeat that behavior ever again, right? That level of humility, that level of willingness to take responsibility and hold yourself accountable is a big green flag. But the person who says, oh, well, you're reacting that way because it's your reaction. I didn't do anything to piss you off. You're the one who's being overly emotional. Or whatever they might say is going to drive you crazy. If you want to have a successful long-term relationship, you have to be with somebody who is willing to look within themselves and take responsibility for their behavior. And by the way, you have to be that person. So as you listen to this, take personal inventory. Maybe you're the person who usually tends to pawn things off on other people and isn't very good at keeping yourself accountable. If you're that person, then that's something that you got to work on ASAP. Uncommon red flag number 4 is similar to red flag number 3, but it's slightly different. This is the in one ear, out the other person, okay? In other words, the person who just doesn't listen. There are people who listen but don't take responsibility because they're arrogant or they don't want to change. And then there are people who just don't pay attention to what you are saying. And you feel like no matter how many times you tell them the same thing, they are not getting it and they're not willing to make a change. Okay? Now, sometimes this is because the person doesn't want to take responsibility. But sometimes this is because the person just truly doesn't value what you have to say, or they are dismissing what you think is important. I had a couple in here yesterday, actually, a young couple, and I was asking the guy, do you hear what your girlfriend is saying she finds problematic with your behavior? And he says, yes, I hear it. I take responsibility for it. I haven't made all of the changes that I need to make, but I know that she's been saying this for a while, and I know that it's frustrating to her that I'm exhibiting XYZ behaviors, okay? So that's a person who's listening. Then I asked her the same things. I said, do you hear the grievances that your boyfriend is telling you? Do you hear him when he says that you do XYZ things that upset him? And she goes, I mean, not really. This is kind of the first time that I'm hearing he's been upset about these things, right? This is a couple who have been together for a year and a half. And you could just see the rage pouring into this guy's face, right? That he's been saying things over and over and over again. And for her, they've just gone in one ear and out the other. So I said to her, okay, if you haven't been listening to these things, do you take responsibility for them? Do you understand now in this moment that these are things that your boyfriend is really upset about? And she was like, well, it's hard for me to take responsibility when I don't know that these things have been a problem. That's somebody who's very, very hard to deal with, right? And of course I said that to her in a nice way, and I guided her to understand what the problems are. But it's maddening when you're in a relationship with somebody who's not paying attention to your emotional needs. And one of the best predictors of long-term relational success is that the other person anticipates your needs before you have to say them. The reason that that's such a positive predictor is that it shows how much attention they pay to what your needs are, and they start to learn you better than you know yourself, to the point where you don't even have to say it, they're already listening. That's a green flag to look out for. A red flag is somebody who you have to say the same thing over and over again, and nothing seems to change. The 5th red flag that I want to talk about is the secret keeper, also known as the information omitter, okay? Now this is slightly different from a liar. Everybody knows that you shouldn't be with somebody who lies, who cheats, who steals, who betrays trust, okay? But then there are people who appear to be slightly less pernicious. These are people who don't lie to you, but they don't tell you the full truth. And I think the reason people don't know how much of a red flag this is that this is subtle. This is kind of hard to spot. But here are some good ways to spot it. First of all, if somebody is extremely guarded about their past, if somebody says, my past is my past, it's not relevant, I don't know why you would need to know about my family history, my previous relationships, mistakes that I've made, that's a huge red flag right there. That is somebody who does not want to open themselves up to scrutiny, probably because they have a lot of skeletons in their closet. Now, the fact that they have skeletons in their closet isn't necessarily problematic. The fact that they won't open up to you about it and that they're hiding that information is problematic. Another red flag here is somebody who refuses to give you their phone password, or somebody who turns their phone away when they're sending a text, somebody who insists on having their quote unquote personal privacy, right? They're like, you can't read my DMs, you can't read my messages, right? Now, you shouldn't necessarily be asking to read their texts and their DMs. You should respect a certain boundary and a certain sense of privacy unless you really feel a need to go investigating. But if you ask, hey, if I were to ask you for your phone password, and if I were to ask you to let me read your messages, what would you say? And they're like, absolutely not. Why would I let you do that? That's an invasion of my space, blah, blah, blah. That's a big red flag right there. That's somebody who's going to tell you half-truths, and they're going to keep secrets. And trust, transparency, openness is the foundation. It is the building block of every successful, healthy relationship. If you have somebody who's not telling you the full truth and wants to maintain their own privacy, you've got to ask the question, why? What's going on with that person? So I hope this was helpful. Please send this episode to somebody who may be newly dating and is trying to suss out whether the person they're dating is right for them. And if you have any questions, reach out to me anytime.